We're going to continue on with our formula practice. We're starting out at this top note on the 8th fret on the E string, looking at the C major. Our focus, however, not being on the notes in the C major, but on the relative position, realizing that the fretboard, like an Excel worksheet, is maneuverable, the relative positions being able to shift up and back, so that if I know the concepts for the major scale, then I can move that same thing up and down the fretboard. Also, I'm also know all of the notes and all of the other modes in relation to the major scale. So that's going to be useful as well in order for us to pack as much information as we can into as little of a learning prospect as we can. So we're going to try to compact everything together. That's one of our objectives with these exercises, coming up with exercises that helps us to work on our fingering as well as our understanding in as little a time as possible. Once we execute and get good at the exercises, to do that, we want to get quite specific with our terminology and exactly what we're doing. And one of the problems with doing that is that the guitar theory or any kind of music theory is kind of cyclical. You start to go around in a circle, and I'm comparing this lately because I'm into the space stuff lately. Like if you're in space and there's no gravity, you've got no vector, no orientation, you're floating around, and that gets disorientating. So what do you have to do? You have to kind of pick where your focal point is going to be. And so that's what we need to do in music typically as well, because when we're thinking of music, we're looking at things from all these different perspectives. We have the same notes, and you might think, dude, there's only 12 notes? There's only 7 notes in a scale? How hard can it be to do like music theory? It's not even the whole alphabet. I know the whole alphabet. There's not even a whole alphabet in it. There's only 12 in there. But if you start looking at it from all the different combinations of the perspectives that you can look at it from, you realize the combinations become somewhat, if not infinite, close enough to infinite for us, right? So we have to basically then, how are we going to break down those perspectives so we can line up what we are looking at? And the way we typically do that in Western music is we use the C major scale, or not the C major, but the major scale, in particular kind of the C major, because that's what the guitar is framed towards. But let's just say the major scale as kind of our reference tool, our point of reference, our vector of orientation that we have on Earth that goes, the ground is down because of gravity and whatnot. That's what we're going to kind of say is the case with the major scale, even though all of the other modes are equivalent in reality. They're just as valid a perspective to be looking at. The major scale is otherwise known as the Ionian mode. The other modes, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian. Now, and the Aeolian. And sorry, I had to sneeze there. I think I paused it before I sneezed. So in any case, and the Locrian. All right. So that's going to be the idea. Now, how can we learn the fretboard? The basic ways that we learn the fretboard. One way is by shape. So I want to learn the fretboard by shape, often using the caged system, and then going from a 3-note caged system to a 5-note pentatonic to a 7-note scale. And then we can break that down into 5 chunks. We're in that middle chunk right here, which is right in the middle of the guitar, which is what I would call position number 1. You could also call it a G-shaped C major chord. Why? Because if I look at that G shape right here, and I move it up to here, to that C note, then you can see here's the G shape. From here, boom, 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 boom. That's the fingering of the G shape. Now, obviously, if I finger it the same way, I've got open notes that I'm playing, so I'd have to play it more like this, you know, duh, and bar it like that or whatever. But you get the idea. You can name the shape. In terms of position 1, you might know it from a pentatonic position, which goes from the 5, 8, 5, 7, 5, 7. If I add all the notes, 7 notes, we get to there, right? So that's going to be a shape that's fairly common. So I can learn that shape, and I can just learn all of the notes in the shape, and I can learn that that C is my root. And then I can convert, if I know that, to all of the related modes, because all the related modes, the D Dorian, the E Phrygian, the F Lydian, the G Mixolydian, use all the same notes. It's just changing the focal point of where we are at. The problem with changing the focal point of where we are at, however, is that usually we reorientate, say, the Dorian to the 1 position. That's why I call it relative position number 1. So now we've changed kind of our vector of what, where we're viewing the thing from. That's going to disorientate us, right? But if I give my absolute modes the same orientation with regards to orientation, I think that's the same, with regards to the major scale, then that will help us to ground ourselves, right? So I could say now I'm on the Dorian, now the D is the first, but I'm still going to call the Dorian absolute mode number 2. By doing that, then it allows me to tie it into the relative major scale, which is kind of like being on Earth rather than on Mars, right? I could say, okay, I can see how the perspective from Earth would be. This would be up and down from my perspective, right? So that makes it a little bit easier for me to understand, is the general idea. So once we learn the shapes, we could break these shapes down into smaller shapes so that I can memorize them strings by string, 2-string and 1-string sets. There's repeated strings, the E's repeat. So I could say within this shape and within each of the 5 shapes, I can break it down to what I call a double stop square or house shape, and then a 2-note per string, just a 1-string shape, and then a house double stop shape. So I'm going to try to emphasize that. Now this one looks skewed because this tectonic plate moved to the right. I call it a tectonic plate to visualize it, meaning the fault line right here, difference in tuning between these 2 strings, shifted this box to be shifted up. Otherwise, you have the same shape there. We have to deal with the fault line in order to visualize it that way. That helps us to basically break it down further, and it also helps us to identify each note. I'm not looking for the individual notes, but each relative position to the scale I'm in. Meaning, I don't care if I'm in the major scale, the Dorian, or the related Phrygian. What I want to know is what's the start in relation to the major scale that I can name the modes after. So you can see here, the B is the Locrian, the C is the Ionian or major scale, the E is the Phrygian, the F is the Lydian. That's always the case even when I go to the related mode. So the C major is related to the D Dorian, in other words. Although I'm focused on the D Dorian as now my tonic, changing the perspective, the C is still the Ionian. The Ionian is still in that same shape. The F is still the Lydian. The E is still the Phrygian. The B is still the Locrian in this particular shape. Now, if you shifted the whole shape up to like a G major scale, then all of these notes would shift, but the shape would remain the same. If I locate the box with regards to the G major and related modes, they will all have this, you can name them by mode, right? So that's going to be one of the things I want to emphasize in my mind. I want to be able to say I can identify things possibly by shape and then 2-string shapes within that shape and give it an absolute modal name, because that will help me with my chord construction. So that's what I'm trying to get into my practice as well. So that's the other. Now the other way we can learn this is by octaves, by intervals, meaning I can look at each of these notes as we have now named as a mode, giving them a modal name, and I can build around that this same shape. I can build this same shape by putting like my what do they call it when you draw a circle, a compass? Like you put the point of the compass on any note and then you draw the shape around it. Now, it won't be a circle in that case, but it will be based on the dimensions from that center point. And we call that the intervals. So I can then look at each of these shapes and I can build any of these modes from that center point. That's useful for chord constructions in particular. That's not going to be our main focal point here, but we'll touch in on it as we discuss the third way that we can look at this, and that's by formula, which is quite logical on a piano, which is like one string on a guitar is equivalent in essence to a piano, except that we don't have the skinny black keys, right? The black keys are just the same size as the other keys. So it's all symmetrical. That's why the guitar is actually more symmetrical than a piano when you go from scale to scale, because you don't have to adjust your finger positions, as you move from, because the black keys aren't a different size than the white keys, right? So that's going to be the idea here. So when we learn it by formula, then once again, we usually use the major scale or Ionian mode as our key or reference point. That's what the piano is tuned to, the C major scale, basically, or, the major scale in essence, or the, C major and related modes, you can think of it. But most people think of it as the C major scale. And I learned the formula, which is whole, whole, half, and then whole, 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 half back to home. My voice is going, sorry about this. But that's going to be, so that's the idea. But if I start that formula from any other spot, if I started it from the D, it would be the same formula. But from that perspective, we would start the formula from there. And that would be how I can create the Dorian. The reason this isn't quite as useful to most people's thinking when they were first thinking of it on the guitar is because we don't usually play the formula on one string as you would on a piano. We usually are going to optimize one hand position. So our goal usually is to say, how can I get all my notes within 4 to 5 frets, because I have 4 to 5 fingers, which means I'm not going to count up the guitar this way on one string, which makes the formula less useful to most people. In particular, because we don't understand what the interval is between the strings. But if I know the interval between the strings, then it could be quite useful, right? Because then I can play I can count through my formula and just account for the fact that I've gotten to my pinky. Maybe I want to go to the next string. Instead of going to this D, I go to this D. If I know how to do that, because then I don't need to memorize just the shape. In other words, when I go in this shape from this pinky to the pointer, I can know that because I know the shape, which most people do on the guitar. But I can also do it because I know that I'm trying to go a whole step from here, and I know from pinky to pointer is a whole step. And so that's another way I can see it. And my theory is that the definition of knowing stuff is being able to see it from more perspectives. The more perspectives I can see the same thing, the better I know that thing. And so that's what I want. That's what I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to do it by shape, but I'd also like to be able to say, hey, look, I'm going from here to here is a whole step. So I know that that's going to be a whole step from here to here. That also means that if I learn the formula, then if every time I want to walk up a scale, then all I have to do is look at the intervals of either a 1 note away half step or a 2 note away whole step. In other words, if I'm going from this D to from the C to the D, I can see it's a whole step here, it's a whole step here. If I go to that D, I'm not thinking about octaves, I'm thinking about just as the notes in a circle. I can think of it as going here as a whole step. I can think of it going here as a whole step, here's a whole step, here's a whole step. So that means that the intervals as I'm going from note to note will always either be a half step or a whole step, and usually it's a whole step, right? Usually you're going to do a whole step, but sometimes it's a half step. Whereas if I'm thinking of the intervals from the first position, then I have all of the intervals that I'm going to be looking at that are relative, like 1 note away, 2 notes away, 3 notes away. So you've got the minor second, the major second, the minor third, the major third, the perfect fourth, the perfect, and so on and so forth. So if you're walking up the scale, then I could break up the scale anywhere I want if I know whether I'm taking a whole step or a half step, and I know where the whole step and half step intervals are on each string, because then I can easily jump to that point on any of the other strings. So that's one of the reasons that I think it's useful to kind of learn this concept. So that's going to be the idea that we're going through here. Let's do a quick recap on the process. So here's our formula down below. This formula is based on the low string and the top string, which are the same strings, which we'll have to account or adjust for if we're on any other string, which we'll see basically as we go. Note that the guitar repeats at the 12th fret. So here, that E is the same as this E, different octaves, but I'm going to think of this as a circle. So I'm not going to keep on going up past the double fret here. I'm going to go around on one set of strings, or one octave basically per string is going to be the general idea. So for example, if we went from this C here and we went up, we're going from the first to the second. So here's the first over here, here's the first, and then we're going to the second. From the first to the second is going to be, let's see how many different ways I can kind of see this. If I go to the first to the second, it's a whole step to the second, and it's going to be a whole step here, okay, to the second, and then I'm going from the second to the third. Now, by the way, the second to the third, let's go to the second to the third, is going to be a whole step by this capital W. Second to the third, second to the third is a whole step. So that's 2 whole steps. So in the major scale, if I was to look at it from the perspective of the root, now the distance from the C note is a 4-note away major third, right? So now I'm from here, I went from C, I went to D, and then I'm on the E. Now that E repeats on the top because now I'm on the 12th fret over here. So there's the E over here. So now I'm going to go from the E from the 3rd to the 4th. So from the E to the F is going to be a half step. So we're going to go half step from the 3rd to the 4th. 3rd to the 4th is going to be a half step. If I look at it from the perspective of intervals from the C, now what's the distance from this C? It's a 5-note away perfect fourth. It's a little difficult to count backwards. If I go 5 notes up, you get to this F over here. 12 minus 5 would be 7. So 7 back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 back to that F. So then if I go from the 4th to the 5th, so now I'm going from this F, let's do it this way, to the 5th, 4th to the 5th, we're going to go 4th to the 5th here. That's going to be a whole step, so it's going to be the whole step going from here to the 5th, which is going to go from here to the G. And if I look at that G from the perspective of the major, of the C here, what's that distance? It's going to be a 7-note away perfect 5th. 7-note away perfect 5th, which if I went up 7 notes this way, it'd be 7 notes away. We're going behind it, so 12 minus 7 is 5 notes back, inverse distance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if I go from the 5th to the 6th, so we're going to go from the 5th to the 6th, it's going to bring me up to the A, 5th to the 6th is going to go from here to here. So that's going to be a whole step, 5th to the 6th. If I measure it in terms of intervals, it would be a 11-note away major 7. Wait a sec, I just went to the 7. 5th to the 6th would be a 9-note away major 6. Also noting it's the Aeolian mode, meaning now I'm on mode number 6, what I would call it, absolute mode number 6, Aeolian mode. Now it's going to be a 9-note away major 6, meaning if I went this way 9 notes away, I would get to A. Inverse distance, because I'm going behind it, is 12 minus 9, which would be 3. So 3 notes back, there's my A. And then if I go from the 6 to the 7, I'm going from the 6 to the 7, and then we're going from this A to the B, 6 to the 7. So that would be a whole step. And then if I'm on the 7 from the perspective of the root, it would be an 11-note away major 7, meaning if I went from C up 11 notes, I would get to a B. Inverse distance 12 minus 11 is 1 note back. I can also see that that B is what I would call absolute mode number 7. So that it's always going to be that way. So where does it live? It lives at the top of what I call the house or the box. And then we're going to go from the 7 back to the 1, or you can call it 8, which brings me back to the C. That's going to be a half step. And that's going to bring us back home. And so that brings me back back home. To ba-boom. Okay, so now let's do that same thing, but let's do it inside here, inside of our shape. So now we're going to go, okay, we're going to go from the first to the second. So now I'm on this C. I'm going to try to keep it in this shape. So we're going to go from the first to the second is a 1 note away. I'm sorry, wait a sec, is a whole step. First to the second is a whole step. So we're going to go now, instead of going out here, whole step, we're going back here, which is a whole step. How do I know that's a whole step? Because it's a 2 note away whole step. And if there's a distance between 5 notes or 5 notes between the strings, except for where the fault line is, so it's going to be 5, 4, 3, 2. So the general rule is if I'm going from pinky to pointer, you have a whole step. So, okay, so that means I went from here to here. And so now I'm on what I would call absolute mode number 2, the Dorian, noting that the Dorian is living on what I call the double stop shape. So it's on the bottom of the double stop shape, and so you can see it there. And then I'm going to go from the 2, there's a whole step to the 3. So 2 is a whole step to the 3, 2 is a whole step to the 3, going from what I would call the Dorian to the Phrygian. So going from absolute mode number 2, Dorian, to absolute mode number 3, the Phrygian. So the Phrygian lives at the bottom of the house. So this is C's house. The Phrygian's in the basement. It's the rocker, punk rocker kind of mode. That's how I think of it, because it has that really kind of heavy minor second to it. So we have the 3 there, and then we're going from the 3 is a half step to go to the 4. 3 is a half step to the 4. So that's going to be a half step. All right, and then the 4, we're going from the 3, which is absolute mode number 3, Phrygian, to the 4, absolute mode number 4, which is Lydian. So we're going from Phrygian to Lydian. So the step from Phrygian to Lydian is always a half step, even if we're looking at it from a different perspective. So now we're going to say, so that's going to be the Lydian lives on the bottom right side of the house. It's a major mode because it has a major third. So then we have the same over here on this. So now we also have, what was I on here? Oh, wait a sec. No, I'm not. Yeah, here's the third. So now we're going to go from the 4th to the 5th. So we're going to go to the 4th to the 5th. So now we have to do, once again, I'm not going to go out here because I'm going to stay in the shape. So that would be a whole step. We're doing a whole step back this way. So that's going to be pointer to pinky or pinky to pointer. So it's going to be a whole step. How do I know that's a whole step? Because it's going to be 5 notes between the strings, 5, 4, 3, 2, back to here, okay? And now we're on what the absolute mode number 5, which is a major mode, would be a major chord that we would build, which is the Mixolydian. The Mixolydian isn't in the major house, even though it's the major, it lives with the minors, so it's down with the double stop, or I'm sorry, here it's hanging with the A and the 2 note per string shape, what I call the meat of the hamburger, because if it was a pentatonic shape, that would be the pentatonic shape. This is always in the middle, or the meat of the hamburger. I'll say, and then we're going to go from the 5 to the 6. 5 to the 6 is going to be a whole step. 5 to the 6 is a whole step, going from G to A. And so that's going from absolute mode number 5, which is Mixolydian, to absolute mode number 6, which is the Aeolian. And the Aeolian is the main minor mode. So if we built a chord from there, that would be a minor chord, and then and so it's on the meat of the hamburger, hanging with the mixolydian, and then we're gonna go from the 6 to the 7, 6 to the 7, and 6 to the 7. That's gonna be a whole step. So I can't go to here because I'm going to go outside my shape, so it's a whole step back. That's going to be pinky to pointer. How do I know that's a whole step? Because it's 2 notes away. The distance between the strings is 5, 4, 3, 2. And so that's going to be B, that's the Locrian. The distance from the Locrian to the major is the C in this case. This is an 11 note away, major 7. And then if I go from there, from the 7 back to the 1 or to the 8, that's going to be a half step. That brings us back up top. Okay, so that's going to be then the octave when I go from the B to here. So notice that's still in the top of the house. So here's my house, which has been shifted up because of the kink in the tuning, the fault line, but it's still the top of the house. Okay, so that's going to be the general, that's my general outline. So now we're focusing in on